let's talk about tenacity and willpower and how to enhance your level of tenacity and willpower. I will also mention certain cases where having too much tenacity and willpower can be problematic for mental health and physical health. But for most people, I believe that enhancing one's level of tenacity and willpower would be advantageous. Now, you'll be relieved to know that while there are a near infinite number of different circumstances where one would need to draw on tenacity and willpower in order to succeed, there is one major mechanism within the brain, indeed one major mechanism, by which tenacity and willpower are generated. And it arrives through the activation of a particular brain center that is a hub. That is, it lies at the interface of many other neural circuits and has input from all the critical neural circuits that one would need in order to generate tenacity and willpower. Now, we are going to return to that particular neural circuit a little bit later after we talk about the psychology of willpower, because in talking about the psychology of willpower, it will frame up as to why understanding this one particular brain center or hub of inputs and outputs from different neural structures in the brain and body will indeed allow you to get the most out of the tools that have been shown in scientific research to enhance your level of tenacity and willpower. In other words, understanding the psychology of tenacity and willpower, while valuable, if it's coupled with an understanding of the underlying neural mechanism, and notice I use the singular, neural mechanism, not mechanisms, for generating tenacity and willpower, will allow you to use and to tailor the specific protocols for enhancing tenacity and willpower to your unique circumstances. So this is yet another case where certainly life circumstances vary from one person to the next. The need for tenacity and willpower varies tremendously. For instance, some people may need more tenacity and willpower in order to engage in certain behaviors. Others of us might need more tenacity and willpower in order to resist certain types of behaviors. Today, you will learn about the brain center that governs all of that. And then you can frame it within the psychological understanding of tenacity and willpower so that you can get the most out of the protocols that we will discuss. Let's start by talking about what tenacity and willpower clearly are, and separating tenacity and willpower from some other psychological constructs that they often get confused with. Because this will be important in understanding exactly what we are trying to build when we say we want to build tenacity and willpower. So tenacity and willpower can be distinguished from habit execution. Habit execution is what you do anytime you wake up in the morning, maybe you lie there for a bit, maybe you get out of bed immediately, hopefully you get outside and get some sunlight in your eyes, especially on cloudy days, go brush your teeth, use the restroom, engage with others in your home if you live with others, etc. All of those sorts of behaviors, while on some days can be a bit more challenging, especially the get out of bed part. Maybe you didn't get a great night's sleep the night before, for instance. But all of those sorts of behaviors are behaviors that you have the neural circuits to generate, and that typically you can generate without a lot of willpower required. Now, willpower, sometimes also referred to as tenacity, grit, or persistence, is a distinctly different phenomenon than habit execution, because willpower and tenacity require that we intervene in our own default neural processes, such as habits or particular patterns of thinking, and essentially govern ourselves to do or not do some particular thing. And that process requires effort. It requires energy. And I think all of us are familiar with that feeling of effort or energy that's required in order to engage in a behavior that we really don't feel like engaging in, or avoiding a behavior or a thought that by default we would naturally just engage in. And when I talk about energy in this context, I'm mainly talking about neural energy. Remember that neurons, nerve cells in your brain and body, use chemical and electrical signaling to communicate with one another. That's what allows you and all of us to do all the things that we do, think, feel, move, etc. Now, of course, that chemical and electrical communication requires fuel sources that indeed come from things like glucose, ketones, the creatine phosphate system. Multiple fuel systems feed the energetics of the brain. But ultimately, when I talk about energy in today's discussion, I'm talking about the energy required to engage in or to resist in a particular behavior. And that level of energy can be quite high, depending on how much resistance we are feeling internally or externally, right? Somebody can be telling us you're not going to be able to do this, you can't do it, and you can say, no, I have a ton of resolve, I have a ton of tenacity, willpower, and I'm going to push past all the barriers that you are setting up for me on the outside. Oftentimes, all too often, I should say, we experience resistance from the inside, where we are feeling like we don't want to do something, or we really want to do something and we are having trouble either engaging in the thing that we don't want to do or that we know we should do, but we just don't feel that level of motivation for, or we are having a hard time resisting the thing that's pulling us toward it. So in that context, it's important for us not to just distinguish tenacity and willpower from habit execution, but also draw out a continuum with tenacity and willpower at their most extreme on one end of that continuum, and apathy and, yes, depression on the other end of that continuum. And we will return to the topic of depression a little bit later, but I can just cue it up right now by saying that one of the hallmark features of major depression is a lack of positive anticipation about the future that leads to, this is important, there's a verb tense here, that leads to a much lower tendency to engage in the specific types of behavior that would allow one to arrive at a particular new, different, and positive future. So I'm deliberately putting apathy and depression next to one another at one end of the continuum, and I'm putting grit, persistence, tenacity, and willpower at the other end of the continuum. And a little bit later, it will become very clear to you why I put those particular items on the continuum as opposed to other psychological constructs such as motivation. Because it turns out that motivation is what allows you to move up and down that continuum. But motivation itself, as a verb, is distinct from what we call tenacity and willpower. And motivation itself is distinct from what we call apathy and depression. But motivation is the engine or the motor, the verb that allows you to move up and down that continuum. And today you will learn multiple tools that will allow you to move toward the tenacity and willpower end of that continuum by engaging a very specific neural circuit. Before we get into the discussion of neural circuits, I'd like to talk about the psychology of willpower. And this is something that really has been considered by psychologists for well over 100 years. William James wrote about this. The ancient Greeks wrote about this. The topic of willpower is certainly not a new one. And yet the formal study of willpower in the laboratory context, that is bringing human subjects into the laboratory and examining what sorts of conditions allow them to engage their willpower and tenacity, what sorts of conditions really sap or drain their willpower and tenacity, and of course, parallel experiments done in what we call preclinical models, which are animal studies, have revealed to us a lot about the sorts of conditions that allow us to generate willpower and the sorts of conditions that drain our willpower. Now, if we are to throw our arms around that entire literature, there is a big batch of that literature, not the whole batch, but there's a big batch of that literature that believed and still believes that willpower is a limited resource, much like fuel in the body or fuel in a car. Now, the idea of willpower as a limited resource is certainly not a new idea, but again, the formal study of willpower and willpower as a limited resource really dates back a little over 25 years when Roy Baumeister and colleagues started to explore the idea that, of course, had been kicked around for years, that with each additional decision that we have to engage across the day, and with each additional bout of willpower that we have to draw on as a resource, that we would drain this reservoir of willpower that we all have within us. Now, Baumeister and colleagues referred to that process as ego depletion. Now, when people hear the word ego, some people think Freud, ego, superego, id, and so forth. Most people think ego, like somebody having a big personality where they think a lot of themselves. When Baumeister referred to ego depletion, he was defining ego depletion as a concept of oneself and a concept of outside challenges and the degree of effort required to bridge one's concept of self and those challenges. And so ego depletion is really an operational construct within the field of psychology. So we don't want to get too distracted by that word ego. There's a tendency anytime people hear ego, if they hear narcissism or if they hear gaslighting, to immediately assume that they know what that means, when in fact, the formal definitions of those quite often differ from the way that they're kicked around on social media, the internet, and even in a lot of popular writing about psychology. Okay, so let's just note that ego depletion is the term that Baumeister used to describe the ability for our willpower to be depleted with each successive attempt to engage willpower, and by extension, our ability to replenish our degree of willpower if we take a break from making decisions and engaging our willpower. But ego depletion itself isn't the focus right now. The focus right now is whether or not indeed willpower is a limited resource And whether or not with each decision that we make and each effort to either engage in an activity that we prefer not to, at least in that moment, and with each attempt to resist a behavior, thought, etc., that is pulling on us or that we feel that we want to engage in by default, either eating the cookie or thinking the thought or engaging in a particular type of behavior of any kind, and we need to resist that, that it is draining that willpower resource. Now, before I go any further, I know that some of you out there are probably aware that ego depletion and the Baumeister theory of willpower as a limited resource has been very contentious. But today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first present the Baumeister and colleagues' work about willpower as a limited resource, and then I'm going to present some of the conflicting evidence that Carol Dweck, my colleague at Stanford School of Medicine, and researchers elsewhere have carried out meta-analyses and entirely new experiments, which indeed, in some cases, contradict the findings of Baumeister, but more often than not, contradict the conclusions that Baumeister drew about willpower. So if we are to understand the psychology of willpower and tenacity, it's important that we understand the concepts of ego depletion and willpower as a limited resource, even if, after hearing all the evidence, you decide that willpower is not a limited resource. And in fact, I'm quite confident that once you hear about the Baumeister work and then you hear about the work of Dweck and others, which in some ways counters the conclusions of Baumeister, that you'll have a much firmer and certainly a much more complete understanding about what tenacity and willpower are. And perhaps, and here I'm revealing my own leanings when having examined the totality of the data, that tenacity and willpower in some cases is a limited resource that can be replenished by engaging particular processes within the body. That's right, within the body. But that willpower and tenacity, and most importantly, how to engage tenacity and willpower, especially when you have a lot of challenges in front of you, not just one challenge, but multiple challenges that need to be carried out throughout the day, over weeks, over months, etc., that tenacity and willpower can be drawn upon repeatedly without them being depleted if you are clear on your beliefs about tenacity and willpower. So I realize that what I just brought up was a controversy about something that I haven't even discussed yet. So it might seem like a bit of a swirl of information for which there's really no context. But the reason I bring up the controversy at this stage of our conversation is that the moment that the words ego depletion or willpower as a limited resource falls out of my mouth, I can hear those voices out there saying, wait a second, I thought that was all debunked. And I want to make very clear, willpower is a limited resource, and ego depletion have not been debunked. It's simply a controversial area of psychological research. And more importantly, for today's discussion, we have to understand the theory of willpower as a limited resource if we are to understand the controversy, that is the counter-argument of what willpower really is, that comes from other groups. So I really want to give you both sides of the story so that when we get to the underlying neural mechanisms for tenacity and willpower, and we get to the tools and protocols for increasing your level of tenacity and willpower and your flexibility of willpower in different contexts, that you'll be able to get the most out of those tools and protocols.